right, so I'm going to talk to you about some of the most recent work I've been doing looking at misgendering, but more broadly, acceptance and use of gender-related, I would say pronouns, but you're going to see other languages where gender is not just on pronouns. I'm just going to start by saying, like, I've already gotten so many ideas about this from, like, the talks yesterday and different ways to think about the sort of moral status and behaviors going on. So thank you to all the other presenters. But this is something that I started working on a few years ago when this sort of started to come into the public sphere, and people were talking about pronouns as a social and political issue, and one that, you know, sort of had moral dimensions to it in terms of how we talk about and treat each other. But it's not actually the first, even the first fight obviously about language, but even about pronouns. So back in the Quaker times, so Pennsylvania, home of lots of Quaker heritage, there was a kerfuffle about pronouns relating to the Quakers' preference to use the familiar pronoun thou rather than the more, you know, sort of formal pronoun, because they viewed everyone as being equal in the eyes of God. And this caused a stir. Now, this distinction has been lost in most dialects of English, but it's not the first time that pronouns were sort of a social issue. So I think that's interesting. Oh, yeah, that's showing for you. Okay.
One down. Or sorry,
Great. Okay. And so before this, as I was telling people yesterday, I was working mainly on perception and music cognition. So how did I start looking at pronouns? Basically, a student asked me, what's the deal with pronouns? Why can't people get my pronouns right? And so I was like, I don't know, let's do some studies on it. And I was sort of inspired by this study that wasn't looking at pronouns, but it was looking at how people react to variations in language, specifically typos and grammars in emails. And it has a sensational headline, but that's not really what they found, as is often the case with science headlines. But they did find that personality differences were linked to how people reacted to typos, whether they got angry about them or not. And in my view, I was thinking about this in terms of any, you know, not errors, but in language change, is that some people are sort of annoyed by change and other people sort of roll with it. And so if you are one of the people who is annoyed by change, when you have a new thing to talk about that you can't do in your language, you kind of have two choices, neither of which is really ideal for you. You have to either change something about the meaning of a word, or you have to make up something new to do it, and this is a tough decision for a lot of people. So I sort of started this from a standpoint of looking at conservatism in language generally, but soon discovered that there's way more going on than that. That has a lot more to do with gender than it does with language. We use the term gender in language, but it's not the same thing as what I'll call gender. So we can actually think about gender in at least three different ways. So we can think about the sort of the world around us, the biosocial input. Basically, what is gender as something that is you express outwardly in the world as a social category. Then languages, each one being different, can have formal features of their grammar that encode something that correlates with that in different ways. And there are many different ways to do that. And then we have kind of the glue that holds those together, which are your inner mental categories of gender that come from your experience of the world, but they also sort of link up to your linguistic system. And this is idiosyncratic, right? Everybody forms their own mental categories of the world from their experience, so we should expect variation, right? So some people's experience of the world pays more attention to that area in the middle. So this is a bimodal distribution of gender in the world, but it's not a binary distribution. But often for many people, their gender categories mentally are binary, but for other people they are not. And I should say here, I'm not saying that non-binary is its own unitary category. This is like a stand-in for things that don't fit into that binary. And I started thinking about this in terms of, like, what could I make an analogy to in terms of explaining what people are doing. And this isn't a perfect analogy, but I was teaching about this at the time, thinking about different ways to think about behaviors within a tri-level model from cognitive science, where we can think about the physical architecture of your brain or other system that is carrying something out. We can think about the high-level computational features, like what are the patterns that we observe, and we can think about the algorithms or mental processes that tie those things together. And so I started thinking about these three levels of gender in a similar way, in that we can use these levels of explanation to describe different behaviors. So if we're talking about a calculator, we can say, well, why does 2 plus 3 equals 3 plus 2? This is a property of math, right? It is a computational property. Then there's features that relate to the physical architecture of where that's carried out. And then there's the way that it's programmed, right? That gives you certain results. And so I started thinking about this in terms of what people are doing with language. So if we want to explain something like, why can't my uncle use singular they, there might be different reasons for this. It could be because there's something about his grammar that doesn't allow him to do this, but it could also be because his inner mental theory of gender has to do with a binary rather than a spectrum of gender, right? And it could also have to do with the input from the world around you. What do you notice or not notice about gender? What is your experience of the world? Okay, so likely there are going to be explanations at all of these levels that go into this. And I don't want to begin to say that I have this all figured out, but I'm sort of in the process of trying to figure out what's going on at each of these different levels that contributes to what people are doing with language, as well as some things that don't fit in here, which is related to the theme of this conference. Specifically, what are our sort of general social norms and things about how we interact with each other, as well as what happens when languages and cultures interact with one another. And many of these could be vectors for change in the language. But so far, research from my lab and from others has found that there is as much to do with non-language things as there is to do with language. So behaviors like getting people's pronouns correct or not is relatable to individuals' attitudes about transgender identities, whether they accept those or not, as well as personality factors, our concepts of gender roles, sexism, and personal experience or identity, sexual orientation, and gender. Okay, so our beliefs and experiences are moderating how users respond to variation in language, and likely how they're using it as well. Okay, so I had been doing work mainly in North American English on this, but obviously that's just one language of the world, and I wanted to know more about what are the patterns across languages and how do they influence one another. And this is an issue, a social and political issue in many places around the world, but each debate kind of has its own flavors and interacts with the local, pre-existing issues and controversies, right? So I had the opportunity to do some work in Malta where, they have their own sort of debate around this. So why Malta and why Maltese and Maltese English? Well, for one, it is a very linguistically interesting place to me. It's right in the middle of the Mediterranean, so it has linguistic influence from basically every power that came through the Mediterranean kind of left its mark on this. It's a language that's very different from English, but conveniently it is written in the Latin alphabet, so unlike Arabic, I can actually look at it and see what's going on without having to learn a new alphabet. So it is also a place that is a destination for the English learning industry because it is an affordable place with nicer weather than many of the other English-speaking destinations in Europe. And so despite the fact that it's very small and has is a more marginalized variety of English that's spoken there. It has an outsized influence on English as a second language around the world. So there are lots of students who come from especially the Middle East and Asia to learn English in Malta. Also culturally, it's a very different place from what I've been looking at, which is like the North American context. So as an outsider, it was at first sort of a place of contradictions for me. It is both highly religious, high degree of religiosity, but it is also a leader in LGBTQ rights in Europe and in the world. It was one of the first places to pass laws and recognizing same-sex marriage, non-binary gender, and so on. So it is, I wasn't sure if many of the sort of attitudes and other things that I was finding in North American context would be able to generalize to this. So I honestly had no idea what I would find. So I did a study where I sort of replicated one of the studies I'd done looking at grammatical acceptability. I know this is a wall of text, so I'm just going to boil it down to the most interesting examples. So I made what I considered to be sort of analogous examples in Maltese to the English sort of variants that I was looking at. And the ones I'm specifically interested in here are two versions of using singular they. So in English, you can use they in a general sense to talk about anyone, like someone left their phone on the bus, I hope they come back for it, right? You can also use it to talk about a specific person, right? Like, oh, there's Sam, they are happy today, right? And we found that English speakers vary in how much they accept the second one of these. The first one is pretty much standard here to stay, but the second one is currently undergoing change. So I made analogous sentences in Maltese. So much like in English, the plural version of words is not marked for gender, but the singular versions are. It's just that it's marked in a lot more places than English. English has just kind of like a smidge of gender in it, but Maltese marks verbs, adjectives, pronouns, and all of these things. So it comes out all over the place. So we have a generic they version where we're using the third person plural version of a verb here, and one here where we're referring to a specific person. So the first question that I wanted to know is, are Maltese English speakers doing the same things as our North American English speakers? And for the most part, they are. Maybe even, at least the sample that I got, they are doing, they're accepting the specific version of singular they at the same or even higher levels than North American English speakers. So they're behaving pretty much exactly the same way. Singular they is pretty good for them. It's quite high. The neo-pronouns, which are like ze and they, there are a lot of versions of them. Much like the North American English speakers, there's not a high degree of recognition of these. But it was actually higher than I found in the North American sample, so that was interesting. And now what do they do in Maltese with the sort of equivalent versions? Generally, these were rated as lower, but the sort of internal patterns held the same. So using the plural for a singular, like using a plural verb or a plural adjective to describe something singular, were worse than the control sentences, but they were sort of near or above the midpoint. So, and anecdotally, a lot of the Maltese speakers who I showed these to were like, this is kind of weird, but it kind of works for me, right? So like grammatically speaking, like there is, and I'm not a syntactician, but there is something to this sort of idea of plurals being a bit more slipperier and having different features than singular, that they allow some kind of flexibility. But they showed the same pattern where the gender-neutral use of the plural was rated as higher than the non-binary version. So there is the same effect of the definiteness of this, and this is something that we found in our other samples as well. There was a weak effect of age, where as age increased, the acceptability of these variants goes down slightly. But again, it's pretty weak. I think where the really interesting stuff comes in is when we start to look at people's attitudes. So we gave them something called the Transgender Attitudes and Belief Scale, which measures attitudes about transgender and non-binary people on 3 different dimensions. One is interpersonal comfort, another one is human value, and the one that we're interested in here is sex and gender beliefs. So there was a lot of consistency in interpersonal comfort and human value. Those were high across the board. Like, people are generally, agree that transgender and non-binary people deserve rights and they are comfortable interacting with them in different ways. The most variation, though, came from the sex and gender belief. Do you sort of think about gender in a more essentialist and binary way or not? And we found that these affected these definite examples much more. So when you go to use a sort of plural gender neutral form for a specific individual or for someone who is named in the sentence, if you think about gender in a more binary way, the acceptability of these goes way down, right? So this is where I think that those cognitive categories are coming into play. In a generic sentence like someone left their phone on the bus, you're not really thinking about the gender of the person who you're talking about. But if you're talking about Sam over there, if you think that Sam must have a gender and it must be male or female, then that comes into play more, and those are less acceptable to you. Okay. We also found a correlation between what people do in English and they do in Maltese. Right? So at an individual level, if you're more accepting of these variants in English, you are also more accepting of them in Maltese and vice versa. And what is leading me into where I'm looking at this now is, what is the role of that experience of the world? So we also asked people whether they knew people who use different variations of pronouns. And basically, we found that 3/4 of people knew someone who used they, them pronouns in English, but only 1/4 of them knew someone who used non-binary language for themselves in Maltese. Now, of course, the other 50% over here could be non-Maltese people from elsewhere, but what I'm going to show you in a minute suggests that for many Maltese people, they are using this language for themselves in English, but not in Maltese. And that's sort of like where I'd like to go next with this. And so I'm in the process of looking at some semi-structured interviews that I did in Malta, specifically targeting either LGBTQ community members, people who work with language, like language teachers, and just anybody who would talk to me, basically. But I'm going to show you a couple of the major themes from that sort of suggest where this is going, or sort of shed some light on what the numbers are telling me. This is me learning how to be a qualitative researcher, so I'm hoping that it gives me some clues into what's going on underneath the numbers. And I'm just going to show you examples from 3 of these subjects here. And some of the major themes. So one is just the general importance of language. So one of these subjects was sort of language queer activist and language policy person, so was involved with sort of enshrining new Maltese terms in public policy, like the word for transgender. And it is a political issue in Malta. There is both a push and a pushback on changing the language to update policies and so on. Okay. And one other attitude that I encountered frequently in these interviews was in this bilingual situation of people saying, well, you should speak proper Maltese and speak proper English. And that doesn't mean that people necessarily do that. If you ask them, well, do you mix these languages together? They would say, yes, all the time. But, it's not really correct, so I don't do that. And, sorry, this is not supposed to be blocking the words. So there was also this discussion of the public policy versus the actual attitudes within society that are slower to change, and some pushback on this. So this example, I can't edit that, sorry. I'll just fill it in for you. This is someone who is a gay man and is talking about how he appreciates the sort of legal framework that gives him rights, but he's still sort of unsure about what people's attitudes are. And then this was the university student saying, well, yes, people are very accepting of gay people here, but gender is a different thing, and they're not quite so accepting of this, that orientation versus gender are different issues that sort of get put together under the LGBTQ umbrella, but we have to account for their attitudes differently. And that there's this attitude in Maltese society that, this is something that happens in English and is not really necessary, and we don't need to change Maltese to accommodate this. And one subject said, I think the laws actually changed too quickly. I'm happy about them, but they changed faster than people's attitudes, and those are catching up. There's interaction between English and Maltese. Specifically that there are certain subjects that get talked about in English, not in Maltese, even though they could be talked about in both languages. And gender is one of those. I asked people how people share their linguistic identifiers, like their pronouns in Maltese. And one told me, well, you would just say pronouns in English. You would be speaking Maltese, but so like you would say, Yenyi Simni Evan, they, them pronouns, which means my name is Evan, they, them pronouns. So I'm like, even though you're speaking Maltese, you would say your English pronouns. Be like, yeah. So it is not the only topic that came up about that. One was topics like mental health. So like the word for depression, there is a word in Maltese for this, but you might code switch into English to say it, which sort of shows some kind of distance or distancing of oneself from that concept of it not quite being Maltese enough to talk about. And many people talked about the difficulties of adapting Maltese, that it's much easier to just switch to English. So for example, in Maltese, there's not a word for child, you have to say boy or girl, and if you say the plural version, you're saying children, and so people sort of react to this in that way. And the most interesting thing to me was that people said, well, you can be gender neutral in Maltese, it's just very difficult, and even mostly native speakers would say, I'm not good enough at this language to do this, that it's much harder than English. And probably the most interesting theme to me is this tension between Maltese identity and queer identity. There's a strong notion that to be Maltese, you need to speak Maltese. That is an important part of the identity. In fact, there's a whole sort of derogatory term that's used in Malta for Maltese people who prefer English, like they think they're better than us or whatever. And a lot of people would say things like, I wish there was a way to express my identity in my language. Like, I feel most myself and most Maltese when I'm speaking Maltese, but I feel like I can express this part of my identity. I feel most comfortable in my queer identity when I'm speaking about myself in English, and I can't bring these two things together. So there's this tension that I hope to explore a bit more. So next, I want to look more at how this is playing out in real time, in sort of conversations between people, and also what motivates people to move along the path from sort of passively accepting these things to using them in their own language, and what role does our sort of moral judgments about how we treat others play into this. So thank you for listening, and thanks to everybody who helped with this, especially the RAs who transcribed the interviews. Are we doing questions now? Okay.
Thank you. I thought that was fascinating. I'm interested about the sort of language switching what we know from people who speak multiple language, and if there's interesting comparisons to make there. So you're showing that people switch in systematic ways,
yeah,
right, with the pronouns. And I'm thinking in other contexts, not with gender, and what if there's research on that, and sort of how this would compare. I'm thinking more of a distancing, where you kind of talk about this kind of thing in this language, this kind of thing in this language, and so if you were to kind of come up with comparisons, what would that?
Yeah. So I'm not an expert on code switching per se, but what I would say is that this tracks with what is known about that. There are lots of reasons to do that. One is like, I don't know this word, so I'm going to switch it, or this one has an additional connotation that I want to bring in. One could be distancing, right? So some of these words and some of the interviews that I left out here were like, this is a new word in Maltese. Like the word for transgender is transgeneru, which the person who told me about that, who was actually involved with that sort of policy, was like, yeah, we did this. It was an important symbolic gesture that gives recognition to the community, but everybody was already saying transgender anyway, and it is obviously just a translation from that, so you would just say that anyway. I think they were glossing over a bit this sort of like avoidance strategy, but one of the other interviewers told me the thing about mental health, which makes me think, yeah, there is sort of an emotional dimension to it, yeah.
That's really interesting work. I'm wondering, it seems like there's this dilemma where there's a mismatch between the facility of the language to have the words to express these things and people's identities. Yeah. And if you, without one, you lose the other. Are there other examples of how the languages? Yeah, or other examples even without thinking about gender pronouns where these things have been resolved in a way that that people can find a way to maintain their identity and feel like they are still like not derogated or less than, and still not have to like, I don't know, change language. Like, are there examples of things like that?
I'll tell you what I do know about that. In the Maltese case, there is, what was I going to say about that? So there are one interview subject who was not in here was telling me that there are ways to be gender neutral in Maltese, but they essentially require more effort and attention. Like what I like to tell people when they complain about like learning to use pronouns in English, I'm like, you don't know how good you have it. There are only a couple of words, and it's just one step above a language which doesn't have gender at all, like Turkish, Finnish, like it's easy. But so it requires a lot more paying attention and a lot more circumlocution. Like in Maltese, you can say, so if I were to say, I am tall, which I'm not, but if I were going to say I am tall, tall has a gender on it. I have to pick whether I'm going to use the masculine or feminine version. But if I say I'm a tall person, well then tall goes with person, so person is a feminine noun. So it would be normal for any Maltese person to say I'm a tall person and use the feminine agreement, but it's not gendering me, it's gendering person. So like that's an example. And this person who was a fluent Maltese speaker, but their first language was Italian, was like, I don't feel totally comfortable doing this with the language, but I know people who speak this way, and it's very beautiful, and I appreciate that, and I'm trying to learn how to do it. Every language kind of has its own riddle to solve in this way if it is a gendered language, and there are strategies that can be borrowed across languages depending on how similar they are. So probably the greatest success story that I know about is Swedish, where there is a neopronoun, hen, which is used as both a gender-neutral and non-binary pronoun. But I don't know what they do with other like adjectives and so on in Swedish. But part of the success of this comes from it being adopted in media and things, and there's good data showing how attitudes about that have changed over time with exposure, basically. So if you get institutions to adopt this language and use it for long enough, people who reacted negative, people don't like change, right? So if they didn't like it at first, by exposure, they come to sort of accept it more in the long run. I don't think that eliminates people's individual struggles with their identity, but it removes a barrier in terms of getting that language accepted in the public sphere, I would say. One more question. All right, thank you, everybody.